Within a research inquiry, everyone is a stakeholder. It's not just a kind of client sort of top down to agency, then down from agency to field partner, and down from field partner to participant. Everyone is kind of involved in that process, and that we should all be backing each other. Welcome back to the Insight Room, the Good Sides podcast, where we explore some of our work and deep dive on some of our perspectives on the industry and all the things that make us tick. What are we talking about today?
Today we're talking about collaboration as a superpower.
So talking about how in this time we live in and in this environment we're operating in, the merits of collaboration in all its guises.
And how it's not a soft skill, it's actually absolutely imperative. It's interesting because I think that to collaborate well, I think there's potentially a perception that you need to be a real generalist and have lots of different skill sets to be able to collaborate across lots of different things. And we've been talking recently actually about how we don't think that's true.
I actually think the industry is changing quite a lot. There is a bit of a sense that there's a demise in these large networked agencies that offer in effect a fairly generalized solution by doing everything kind of averagely rather than doing a few things well. And I think we've never set out to become that. We've never set out to become a monolith or to become this kind of enormous entity. We're really committed to being a specialist. And I think if you're committed to the craft of what you do, then you have to respect that in other people.
I also think it's a really exciting time where there are lots of independent agencies, lots of people springing up with their own offers and perspectives. And actually it's a fantastic time to be collaborating to really get to some amazing outcomes.
And I actually really love the fact that this is the way the world is going, that actually people who are really passionate and really committed and really good at what they do get to sort of own that craft and not to be subsumed by some sort of bigger machine that flattens them out.
Yeah. I guess one of the flip sides of that, or a fear around that from a client perspective, would be that that could be quite a slow way to work, like working with lots of different specialists, perhaps from different agencies or different parts of the world even. And I know that, there's a lot of talk about the fact that in the world that we live in, we should be able to be working much more remotely across kind of countries and cultures. Like, what do you think about the idea of it being a slower way to work? Do you think that's necessarily true, that it's going to be a bit more clunky?
Yeah, I don't think I've really seen that. I mean, I think it really comes down to how you do it. And I think that if you really embrace it as an idea and as a kind of core part of how you work, I think that you design for it from the outset. And it makes me think about the way that we work with partners in other countries because, we're a global agency in terms of our reach. We do so much work internationally, probably more than we do in the UK, but actually all of that work relies on us having a great network of partners across the world and, finding those people who can really help us understand, help us kind of get deep into culture and into audiences in different parts of the world. And I love that part of the collaboration too. And I think we've never approached partners as suppliers in that context. We've approached them as experts just like us, but just experts somewhere else, and actually pulling them together and thinking about how you develop a collaborative way of deriving insight is really kind of powerful, and it gets you to a much richer place.
That's really struck me actually since joining the Good Side, is that the way in which we work with our fieldwork partners, for example, they're very much part of our team and they're very much briefed on our values, how we like to work, the principles of our process. It feels that they kind of can really meet us where we are. And I think that's probably the most important part of that collaboration, is that there needs to be more upfront work to really align on values and principles of how we're going to work together. But actually, that if you find that you're working with people that share the same values and the same kind of vision, that can be fantastic and just as fast as working with kind of one agency that does it all.
Yeah, I agree. I think also it's about sort of respect, respecting people's expertise and respecting people's time. And if you approach partners in that way and actually think about, where everyone brings their own kind of gift, really, that actually people feel much more kind of celebrated, much more empowered. And I think it means that people look forward to the engagement. We have so many partners where we know they love working with us and we love working with them. And who doesn't want to work with people they really love spending time with?
I think it's also just lovely to work with people who, as you say, are real specialists in what they do, who are at the cutting edge of what they're doing and who are really, really passionate about it.
I think the other side of this kind of agency collaboration piece for us is that it's really about when it comes to working with creative agencies. So you'll know this as much as I do, but there's this old kind of baggage around creative agencies not liking research agencies. This fear that research agencies are going to test their work and mark their homework, and they're going to kind of crap all over their ideas. And I think we've always set out to make it really clear to creative agencies that's not what we're here to do. So sometimes when you get brought in by a client to do some creative development and do some kind of campaign work, what we tend to do is to reach out to the creative agency independently and say, we're here for you as much as for the client. We're here to make your ideas really sing. We're not here to judge your homework. And I think they really appreciate that. And I think what we found through time is that if you try and approach that relationship collaboratively too, so how are we all going to get to a great solution, I think you get to an amazing space. I remember when we first started The Good Side doing some work with an agency and a really kind of, I guess, prominent strategy director. We were a much smaller business there, so I was doing quite a lot of the field work kind of on my own. And we had this relationship where the strategy director and I essentially kind of did the analysis and headline debrief together off the back of the field work, which I thought was, perfect, really. We shared the story, and it was a very kind of like honest, collaborative process of getting to insight, but it meant that they went away really feeling confident in the insights and feel like they really owned that kind of outcome themselves, which meant that the work was really, really sharp. For me as a kind of researcher, it was also a really inspiring process to be that close to the creative.
It also reminds me of something we've been talking about, which is this idea of really having a wider view of who the stakeholders are in your project. I think that kind of there's an old school mentality, which I don't think exists loads anymore, but this idea of, there's the agency and there's the client, and we're there as the agency to take the order and to kind of execute on the order. And actually, I think, it starts primarily first with the audience we're talking to and their customers, like treating them as a stakeholder in the problem, obviously co-creation, all that good stuff. But I do think that, we need to be effective, we need to be taking a wider view of who are all the people that have a stake in this challenge, and how can we understand what matters to them and what the outcome is that they're trying to get to, and actually sort of our job is to clear the way, not just to do the work, but to clear the way and really bring people together to get to that outcome. And that's really ultimately about relationship skills. It's the same skills that we've been honing for many years with clients, but it's really about trying to build those relationships with peers, as well as you say, for a creative agency to know that we care about the outcome for them, we respect their work, and we want to hear what's on their minds with that client. How can we help them to strengthen their relationship?
We're almost surfacing some principles here, aren't we? If there's a point about respect, I think there's also a point about kind of backing each other, that actually we're here to kind of back the client, but also to back the creative agency. And I think almost to back the participants, that actually within a research inquiry, everyone is a stakeholder. It's not just a kind of client sort of top down to agency, then down from agency to field partner, and down from field partner to participant. Everyone is kind of involved in that process, and that we should all be backing each other.
Yeah, definitely. More of that would make work more fun, I think.
I think so. What do you think it looks like to be a real collaborator with clients?
It's an overused term, probably, but I do think that it's being an extension of their team. It's being as fascinated in their business and the reality that they're working in as we are in their category or their customer. And I think that the more that we do that, the better the outcome. What that looks like, I think, on a sort of project basis is really, even if the project itself is, it has a great brief, it's super detailed, we've got all we need to get going, actually taking a step to think, well, who's got a stake in this? Who else should we be speaking with? And understanding who they've got to sell the project into at the end, and what are the pressures of those people, and what are the constraints they're working with. Once we've established those relationships, really treating those as sort of a mini steerco that we work with throughout a process. So if we are moving from a briefing call to an interim debrief to a final debrief, and those are the moments where we connect with clients, I think you're already kind of set up to fail. You really need to be working in lockstep with that crew that you've met at the start to make sure that you're checking in as you go to sort of see that the insights we're uncovering, are they useful for creative development? Are they possible from an R&D perspective? Really being super clear on both sort of the business reality as well as the customer reality.
When you were talking, I was thinking about that kind of one team adage. Is it an adage? Is that what you call them? And it's like this term that kind of gets bandied around, and it's really easy to think of it as being an empty term, but it's only really an empty term if you don't really think about what it means and try and sort of deliver it. And I think that actually it's quite easy to, actually just to sort of step into a client's shoes to really, if you do back them, if you do really care and have a vested interest in their success. And I think that you can sniff it out when people don't care. You can sniff out inauthenticity in the work as much as anywhere. I
agree, and I also think there's of course you need to be empathetic and kind and human as sort of a baseline, but it's more than that. It's really being genuinely fascinated in I guess the tougher stuff, you know, there's tougher stuff that comes with being in a team. Like, where are the conflicts? You know, where are the bits that are going to fall down? Where is there relationship challenges? Because those are those little chinks are the reason why something doesn't work in the end. You know, trying to create an environment where people can be candid, where clients can give you feedback, and you can have those conversations as well as all of the softer stuff, which is the empathy and the listening, which I do think generally as researchers we're really good at, because you know that's our craft.
You know, we've talked quite a lot recently internally about relationships, and I think often that conversation when you're talking to more junior team members is about helping them understand that a relationship with a client is a relationship with a person. It's about kind of just giving a shit about them, really, and about what they're kind of going through and what they're trying to achieve. And it doesn't have to be this kind of complex business or structure. It just is about, as you say, about being human, asking the right questions, having some insight into kind of what they're going through, which, as you say, as researchers, we're really kind of good at. Any organization is a political institution, right? You know, whether you're an agency like us, 20 so people, or whether you are a multinational client, it's a political institution. And so there is a kind of small p politics going on all the time. And actually, I think if your clients aren't talking to you about their internal politics, then you aren't really in a very strong relationship. I think if it is a strong partnership, that's the kind of stuff they will bring to you naturally, because you're there by their side and you're there as their kind of strategic sort of wing person to really help them through that. And I think that sometimes those are the indicators that you are in that kind of honest, collaborative relationship. There's another part of this world of collaboration. I'm sure we'll explore this from a number of angles, but I really wanted to touch on the social side of things, really, and thinking about social problems. So we talk a lot about wicked problems here. It's a theory that we're very familiar with, which is around understanding these kind of complex, knotty societal issues. So things like climate change, things like misogyny, the patriarchy, where they are issues that are, deep-rooted within the culture, that are not owned by anybody, and where there isn't really one solution to solve them. And we often, our work within social change is really exploring these wicked problems and thinking about angles through them. It's a kind of core part of what we do. But I think within that context, a lot of the learning around how to approach these topics is really about placing collaboration at the heart of it. So, thinking about the fact that there are many, many issue holders around an issue, like let's say, take kind of like misogyny, patriarchal misogyny. There are many stakeholders around that issue who have a vested interest in it. It's nested within another number of other associated issues like violence against women and girls. And actually, we need to try and join hands around this thing to share as much as possible. And I think what you find in these spaces is it's really important for people to let go of needing to own the problem or the solution. And sometimes it's really hard for people to do that. People really want to take ownership of solving something, but actually it's about people sharing their learnings. It's about people coming together around a problem. It's like we're pushing this very heavy boulder up a hill very slowly, and you need a shit ton of ants to push that boulder. And actually, part of the nature of trying to approach those things is about, really looking at it collaboratively. And it makes me think about the work that we've done with Movember, where we really put that principle to bear, and it's been a very core part of how, together, collaboratively, we designed the research and strategy process. So we set out to explore the manosphere and online misogyny, but we did it in consultation with a whole range of different organizations. We had civil society organizations, we had media and tech companies, we had government people, gender specialists, so a whole raft of different people with very different perspectives. And we brought everyone together and said, look, we're doing this thing, we want you to be involved, we want to keep you informed, we want you to shape the inquiry with you. And actually, that community has really grown as a result of the project. And I think what we always, from the outset, what we really wanted to happen was for the community to be essentially kind of convened by Movember and driven with insight and learning from the good side, but for it to start to have its own life. And what we found over the course of the community is that now there are side projects happening where, this person met this person and now they're doing something else together. And that is perfect. It was never about the thing staying as a kind of coherent whole or anyone owning the power. It was about trying to create a space where great things could emerge.
I think that's so amazing, and it makes you, when you were talking about it, it made me think about how rare that is actually at the moment, how that's quite a countercultural phenomenon. This idea of genuine community and sort of generosity of sharing. I think, collaboration's key, obviously, in so many different spaces, but I think there's a particularly special thing that happens in the work that we do, that because we're surfacing that human truth, that's something that unifies, as you say, those different groups around a problem, and it really helps you to kind of expedite solving it. And it also just, made me think about sort of the importance of sort of, in general, I guess, insight work, strategy work, of really talking to people who have a stake in the problem, but also talking to people who maybe aren't often asked about the problem. So, if you're working in a commercial environment, seeking out expert academics in the space who are looking at it with a particularly different lens, or talking to, not the usual customer perhaps, or the audience, or somebody on the margins. I think these are the moments where you get to breakthroughs and different results, as well as obviously being able to kind of convene people to kind of move forward together.
If you want fresh thinking, you need to kind of look outside.
Outside in.
Outside in. Both of us have a history in terms of our kind of longer research career where co-creation was like very key to the places we worked in. So, you working at Promise and me working at Face, there were two agencies at the kind of the dawning of the co-creation kind of trend, I suppose, within research, and they were similar kind of agencies around the corner from each other, doing quite similar work, which I found quite funny at the time, although we didn't really kind of know each other. But it might just be interesting to reflect on how that methodology, what's great about it, and I guess where it might have evolved to.
Yeah, definitely. So I think when as you mentioned, like kind of thinking about probably the early to mid 2000s, co-creation felt like a very radical idea. The idea that you would enlist customers as collaborators and treat them as, I guess, adult to adult versus like parent-child. There was a lot of parent-child going on, I think, in the research industry. And Promise's founder, Roy Langmaid, one of the founders, has written many, many good books on that. But I think what's interesting is there was a phase where everyone started talking about co-creation after that, sort of fast followers coming along and saying, oh yeah, we're going to really, we're a co-creation business. We really believe in collaboration. We really believe in human truths. And it felt for a long time like everyone was sort of saying the same thing. I think we've come full circle, actually, where I don't think it's really talked about enough. And I think that with the kind of advent of AI and a lot of the conversations happening around sort of you don't necessarily need to talk to someone that's real anymore, and we can moderate, AI can moderate that for you. I think we're actually getting to a point where co-creation is radical again, and the idea of really enlisting people, spending time with them, talking to them on their level, sharing your brief with them as you would with another kind of a colleague. I think that whole area is radical again.
Yeah, I love that. I also wonder whether it's part of this kind of pendulum polarization kind of phenomenon, which is just sort of shaping everything in the culture right now. We talked another time about the fact that at one end of the spectrum you have kind of synthetic respondents and like flat AI data, and the other end you have kind of deep ethnography with kind of real people in their homes. But I wonder whether the idea of doing things really collaboratively and really transparently sort of sits within that kind of this right hand of this kind of like pairing, which feels very kind of good side in a way, and it feels kind of quite core to how we often work when we can. When we're working with a client where we can be transparent, we always try to be. This is what we're trying to do. This is what we're trying to find out. This is why we're here. And I think there's something in that sense of trying to be as transparent as possible and treat people as collaborators that's kind of really freeing.
Definitely, and I do think it's true that and this isn't just about sort of, I guess, what we get out of it, but it is true that if you enlist someone as a true collaborator and you let them into your problem and they feel invested in it, whether as a participant, they're going to get you more interesting answers. So if I think about Movember and some of the work that we were doing a few months ago, asking young men to take on the role as a researcher. I think you mentioned how, you kind of gave them some snacks. You let the phone, like the voice memo run or whatever, the phone run, and they just sat and had a chat, and we gave them prompts and sort of ways into discussion, and we empowered them to really take on talking to their own community. You get so much more from that. And that is one example of I guess, more of a co-creative approach. I know there's ways to do that through ideation and workshops and high intensity moments, but just even that kind of principle of saying, we're going to hand the mic to you because you're going to, bring a different perspective to this. And you're probably going to get your friend or your friends to open up and share in a way that just maybe wouldn't happen if we were in the room. I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think there's sort of two things that make it almost kind of easier than ever. One is technology. It's so easy to communicate with people and to get someone to, as we did, to just to kind of voice record a conversation. And obviously we designed that kind of inquiry and the setup really well and coached them really well around how they might do it without kind of shaping the response. But I think the other thing is that we're at a point in time where people are so much more used to kind of self-reporting their lives in a way that 10, 15 years ago, we just sort of didn't. Everyone's sort of gone through this social media era of this kind of whole Project Me kind of broadcasting to the world about themselves. And so I think people are so much more, it means I think people are much more self-referential than they ever have been. And I think people are just much less guarded about the idea of talking about how they feel or think about something, because they're spending a lot of their free time, or have been spending a lot of their free time kind of doing that anyway.
Yeah, I also think there's an interesting thing with watches and tracking and just this whole phenomenon of, the tracked life, people sort of being much more aware of their behaviour and what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, where they're spending their time, what's taking their attention, what are they eating, how much have they been walking, how much have they been exercising. Like we've got a much more examined life, I guess, than maybe we did when we started out with this co-creation work.
Yeah, I totally agree. The other thing that stuck with me since that era of working in the mid-noughties around co-creation being the kind of core methodology and running kind of large workshops is, for me, one of the most exciting things about that was getting away from the mirror, stopping having that kind of like, there's a point within standard quality research where, the client is hiding behind the mirror essentially, and the consumers are in the room, and the agency acts as this kind of like magical conduit between the two. I'll take your questions to them and I'll bring back the answers and I'll define the insight from it. And it's there's a real power dynamic there, I think, around who kind of owns the relationship, who owns the idea of an insight. And there's also a kind of client behavior around there, not wanting to come sort of face to face with the people who are, buying the thing that you're selling. And I kind of think that what co-creation did was to really kind of throw all that up in the air. And I think now we have so many more methods that allow us to work with participants in different ways, but I still kind of really hold true to that idea of kind of like shifting that very like old school power dynamic.
Definitely, and I think one of the reasons it's come back around as radical, this idea of co-creating and co-creation, is because not only are agencies rarely in person with the client teams are rarely together. And we may be doing a lot of great research together digitally, finding out lots about people's lives. There's lots you can find out digitally, and we can, as we say, we can brief people on how to go about that in their homes, and we can also be there. But it was quite radical at the time to say to clients, hey, take a couple of days, come hang out with us and some consumers. I used to do a lot of work. We would do kind of like day-long ideation where it was client, consumer, experts, R&D, anyone that had a stake in the problem all together. That was radical then. I think that's even more radical now post-COVID. This idea that you would get on a plane or a train and you would come along. And I can't help but think that would lead to even like the feeling of breakthrough would be just as big now to do that as it was then. What's interesting about those days is when you're co-creating a service or a product or a creative campaign, what you'll get to is a real strong understanding of what people want and need. And what's potentially even more powerful from the day often is not what you created, but the fact that, I don't know, this person that works in marketing got to spend time with this like busy parent who uses the product, and actually they spent lunch together and they had a chat and they understood more about their lives, and they might have understood more about the product or the comms or whatever that the brand's putting out in that moment than they would have done if they'd read 10 debriefs. Do you know what I mean? And so those moments of sort of human truth like established in person, I think were always worth their weight in gold, even outside of like just running the process of the day.
I love those 1-2 day immersions, and that chance for clients, and to really kind of embrace the discomfort that might come with that. You don't have the safety of the mirror, you don't have the safety of the Zoom call. You are kind of in there amongst it, and people can sort of challenge you. And I think what's interesting is that within the non-profit space, the idea of kind of advisory and youth advisory and stakeholder advisory is much more advanced. We're doing quite a lot of work around that space with people like November right now, where we've designed their approach to youth advisory, and we're now running the youth advisory board in the UK, which is just about to start. And I'm really fascinated to see where it goes, because I think it's going to be really transformative for everybody. But I think that part of what's going to make it transformative is the conversation about kind of power and about where you allow people in. So where does the kind of buck stop, and how much responsibility or kind of credence are we kind of paying to this? Because obviously the most radical version is like, this is truly collaborative, and your outcomes will live or die by what comes out of this kind of meeting. The reality is that we're probably somewhere, a little bit in a bit more of a kind of guarded, mediated state than that. But I think it's a really interesting inquiry nonetheless.
Yeah, and I think even when you're not in a, face-to-face co-creation session, I think just thinking about how can I break down the silos in this call or this debrief, or in how I'm presenting this work between the organisation I'm working with and their end user or their end customer. Like, what are the moments of truth? What are the ways that I can can do that is a really good sort of mantra.
When we talk about collaboration with clients and thinking about how we play different roles within that, I think there's a really interesting part of that, which is about being sort of honest about what your kind of your specialism is, but also where something's needed and not needed.
Yes, I think so. I think that sometimes there's a desire to try and own as much of a process as possible. As insight people, as strategists, we love thinking, we love creating new stuff. I actually think some of the best projects that we get to do are the ones where we don't do any field work. Projects where we've been truly consultative and really had the most impact. It's often where an organisation comes to us and says, we've done a lot of thinking around the subject. We've got, 2 decks from this agency. We've got some in-house stuff we did here. We've got some data and we can't crack the problem, or we can't find a single thread through this and what we should do next. And actually being given that as a challenge to synthesize, for example, like all the different reports and insights, and actually come away with a path through that. I love those projects. I think they're often the most fascinating, and they're the ones where you feel like you can play a really big role and have a real difference. And it takes, I guess, not being sniffy about the fact that you haven't been asked to do the work, which I don't think we are, by the way. But I think that could be a response, a potential response, is to say, well, actually, I don't like the work these people did. I think you need to do it again. It wasn't proper. I don't mind about that. I actually just really love the process of sort of trying to knit together different pieces of thinking and actually get to a clear path forward.
Our production team have clients where they've done filmmaking and storytelling around, research that we didn't do. And I think there's something really nice about that, about recognizing that there's a whole skill there. You don't have to buy the whole, solution from us because someone else has done something that's great and it really works. And actually what you really need, I think we're like the best in the business at doing pieces of content that are about taking insight and turning them into kind of human-led documentary. I just don't think anyone else comes near to us, but I see why that is a standalone solution, and I think it's great to be able to recognise that and to be able to kind of celebrate the fact that we can do that, and we can collaborate with other agencies who might have done the early part. I also, and this is a really perverse thing to say as a business owner, but I actually also love it when clients say to us, we're not going to give you that brief because we just don't think it's for you. It's not the best use of your time. I think there's on one side you can think, well, we could have done it and it would have been, some cash, in the pipeline. But I actually think there's also something really amazing about having that relationship with the client where they value you for specific things and they recognize where your kind of special power is and they actually want to really focus their energy with you on that.
Yeah, I think knowing what you're for and who you're for is really, really powerful.
We've really surfaced, I think, some really interesting themes, almost like some principles about how you do this kind of thing well. And one thing we talked about early on was this idea of backing each other, that actually it's really important that you come into a collaboration kind of wanting each other to succeed.
I think that's really true, and I think it's a very easy thing to say, but it's actually really hard to do because, as you say, it's everywhere is political, and even if you don't think a situation is political, it is. And I think it's actually quite a radical idea, and we should keep working on that. I love that idea.
Yeah, radical kindness. Life's hard, we're all humans.
I also think just generally this whole principle of humility, so this idea that you don't have to be across everything and you don't have to have every brief and you don't have to kind of own the whole process, and actually letting people step into their expertise, knowing your part to play in that collaboration. I think what we're basically getting to is that you really can't have ego for this to work.
I love that. It's such a nice way to end. Well, thanks, Kathryn. It's been such an interesting conversation.
Thank you.